On August 15th, 1971, a single television broadcast changed money forever. President Richard Nixon appeared on screens across America and announced something that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier. The dollar would no longer be backed by gold. Within minutes, the entire global financial system had shifted. But here's what they didn't tell you that night. This wasn't a crisis response. This was the final move in a century-long game to transform money from something you owned into something that could control you. The question isn't why it happened. The question is why we never saw it coming. To understand what died in 1971, you need to go back to 1944. World War II is ending, and representatives from 44 nations gather at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The global economy is in ruins. Currencies are worthless. Trade has collapsed. They need a new system, and fast. The solution? Make the US dollar the world's reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Any country could exchange their dollars for actual gold from Fort Knox. It was called the Bretton Woods system, and it meant one thing. There was a hard limit on how many dollars could exist. You couldn't just print money endlessly because someone might show up and demand the gold you promised them. But here's where it gets interesting. The architects of this system, John Maynard Keynes from Britain and Harry Dexter White from the US, had wildly different visions. Keynes wanted a neutral global currency. White wanted dollar dominance. White won. And the seeds of destruction were planted immediately. Why? Because the system had a fatal flaw built into its DNA. The US had to provide enough dollars for global trade to function, but if they printed too many dollars, countries would lose faith and demand their gold back. It was a trap with no escape, and by the 1960s, the trap was closing. For 2 decades, it worked beautifully. The dollar was as good as gold because it literally was gold. Global trade exploded, economies rebuilt. The American century had arrived. But power is expensive. The US was fighting the Cold War, building a nuclear arsenal, launching the space race, and by the mid-1960s, funding the Vietnam War. All of this cost money, lots of it, more than tax revenue could cover. So the US did what any government with a printing press does. They printed more dollars. By 1965, alarm bells were ringing in European capitals. France, led by Charles de Gaulle, started doing the math. They held billions in US dollars, but American gold reserves were shrinking. De Gaulle saw the con before anyone else. In 1965, he announced France would begin converting its dollar reserves to gold. He sent French naval vessels to New York Harbor to physically collect it. Other nations watched and panicked. If France was cashing out, maybe they should too. By 1971, the run on Fort Knox was accelerating. The U.S. held $10 billion in gold, but had promised $80 billion worth to foreign governments. The emperor had no clothes, and everyone was starting to notice. Enter Richard Nixon and his Treasury Secretary, John Connally. They faced an impossible choice: honor the gold commitments and watch Fort Knox empty, triggering economic catastrophe, or break the promise and face global outrage. On that August night in 1971, Nixon chose option 2. He called it a temporary suspension of gold convertibility. That was 54 years ago. It's still temporary. What Nixon and Connally understood, what most people missed, was that this wasn't a crisis. It was an opportunity. Once money wasn't tied to anything physical, it became pure abstraction, pure control. Governments could now print unlimited amounts to fund wars, welfare, anything they wanted, without the constraint of gold reserves. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Currencies crashed. Inflation spiked globally. The 1970s became a decade of economic turbulence. Oil crises, stagflation, unemployment. But that wasn't the real story. The real story was the quiet revolution happening behind closed doors. Within 2 years, every major currency abandoned gold backing. We entered the era of fiat currency, money backed by nothing except government decree. And here's what changed fundamentally. Scarcity disappeared. When money was tied to gold, there was a physical limit. Gold had to be mined, refined, transported. It was heavy, difficult, finite. That friction protected purchasing power. Now, money is created with keystrokes. Since 1971, the money supply has exploded by over 2,000%, while gold reserves barely budged. The result? A hidden tax called inflation. Your dollars lose value every year, not because of market forces, but because governments worldwide can now conjure unlimited currency to solve every problem. Need to fund a war? Print money? Need to bail out banks? Print money. Need to win an election with stimulus checks? Print money. But it gets darker. Once money became digital and unlimited, it became the perfect surveillance and control tool. Every transaction is tracked. Assets can be frozen instantly. Central bank digital currencies are being rolled out globally, promising even more control. Programmable money that can have expiration dates, spending restrictions, or be turned off completely if you displease authorities. This is what they won in 1971, not freedom from gold's constraints, control. Look at the patterns repeating right now. In 2008, The response to the financial crisis was the same playbook: print trillions. COVID-19 response: print trillions more. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet has exploded from under $1 trillion in 2008 to over $7 trillion today. Meanwhile, national debt has become meaningless. The U.S. debt is now $36 trillion and climbing. That number would have been impossible under gold standard constraints. But who cares about debt when you control the printer? Here's the shocking data. Since 1971, the dollar has lost over 87% of its purchasing power. What cost $1 in 1971 costs over $7 today. Wages haven't kept pace. Home ownership is increasingly impossible for younger generations. Retirement savings are evaporating in real terms, and countries are noticing. China and Russia are accumulating gold reserves at record pace. BRICS nations are exploring alternatives to the dollar system. The cycle might be turning again, and most people have no idea what's at stake. So here are your 3 takeaways. First, money's value isn't natural. It's political. The moment they severed the link to gold, money became whatever those in power say it is. That's not economics. That's control. Second, inflation isn't a mysterious force. It's a policy choice. When you hear about rising prices, understand that someone, somewhere, decided to print more money. Your declining purchasing power is their gained flexibility. Third, what happened in 1971 wasn't the end, it was a preview. Central bank digital currencies, negative interest rates, temporary emergency powers that become permanent. We're living through the next phase of this transformation. Here's the warning. Every fiat currency in history has eventually failed. Every single one. The average lifespan is 27 years. We're 54 years into the current experiment. The difference this time is that when the system fails, there's no backup. There's no gold to return to. There's no hard asset anchoring value. We're all floating in an ocean of digital abstractions, hoping those in control know what they're doing. But hope isn't a strategy. The question you should be asking isn't whether this system will eventually collapse. History says it will. The question is, when it does, will you be prepared? If this video made you rethink everything you thought you knew about money, hit that subscribe button. Because understanding how we got here is the only way to navigate what's coming next. And trust me, what's coming next is going to be far stranger than what we just left behind.